Hello, everybody. My name is Maggie Graf. I'm the immediate past Secretary General of the IEA, and I'm very interested personally in the topic of informal work and have been working with the chair of the Informal Work Technical Committee. I will explain to you a little bit in a few minutes what this is for those who don't know it. But today we're going to talk about informal work in Europe. And I will start off with a presentation giving some general statistics and information about informal work in Europe. And then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Christine Priester, who will talk about a very interesting area, or what I think is a very interesting area, that very much gets neglected in most countries, and that is the area of informal work in the sex industry. Correct me, Christine, if that's not the right term. And following that, if we have a little bit of time, we will do have a little discussion and answer any questions that you have put up onto the Q&A. It's much easier for us if you use the Q&A as to put your questions in than if you use the chat. Please only use the chat to pass on technical problems, or exchange information with each other. The other thing that I need to talk to you about is that anybody who would like a certificate for attending this webinar will be sent, you'll all be sent a link to a couple of questions. So you have to listen to what I'm saying so that you know the answers. And then if you fill in the application for the certificate and answer the questions, you will be sent that from the IEA, the certificate. It's not absolutely necessary. You don't have to do it, but if you want to do it, you can. Thank you very much. Okay, you can see a little bit of information here about the technical committee. I will explain in more detail with the next points. That's just saying who I am again. So what is a technical committee? You can see here on the right-hand side of the slide that these are special interest groups. Although they're called technical committees, they are open to everybody that's interested in the topic. And we very much encourage you to contact the chair of the technical committee or any other technical committee that interests you. You will find them all on the IEA webpage, and also the links to the leaders of those committees. The technical committee for informal work is very new, so I'm going to explain to you why we have it. The main reason is that a huge number of people work in the informal sector. And if we only cover people with our ergonomics and human factors work that are in the formal sector, we will miss out on a lot of work that is done outside of the normal system. And the problem with work in the informal sector is that the normal prevention systems don't work very well there. I will explain why later in this presentation. But I think it's essential that we exchange experiences about what does work. Measuring problems is one part of the issue, but exchanging experiences on how to improve them is another one. And that's, I think, an important role for the IEA to provide platforms where we can do that. So what is informal work? What do we mean by it? We use the International Labour Organization definition, and they you can read the definition there. Informal economy or informal work refers to all economic activities by workers that are not covered or are insufficiently covered by formal working arrangements. That is, there's no contracts, there's no the work is not reported to the government. They don't pay tax on it. This is the informal sector. Basically, the types of work in the informal sector are divided into three. The first one is work that is in the formal sectors, but it's not declared. The employers perhaps don't say how many employees they have. They don't report it to the tax authorities. This is called the grey economy. Then number two are very small businesses, maybe usually one-person operations, also that are not formally registered as businesses. And then there are family members who are contributing work to an enterprise, but again, it's not declared as such. In some areas, these sectors fall outside the law anyway, even within Europe, particularly in the area of agriculture and fishing, which are not necessarily dealt with under usual occupational health and safety laws. Then, of course, there's the very big sector in most countries of illegal activities, drug trafficking, trading. I'll come back to this in a little while. The sex trade workers, which we're going to talk about in more detail in the next presentation. And then the whole issue of illegal immigrants who are working within an economy. So the features of informal work. We know that it mostly thrives where there is very high unemployment in a country, where there's poverty, and particularly where there is gender inequality and women may not have access to formal jobs and are therefore more or less forced into areas of informality, particularly in home help and domestic service. However, it is a sector that provides work and income to a very large number of people all around the world. Although we all think about street vendors and entertainers and such people, they are very visible, but in fact, much of the informal work is done behind the scenes, particularly in home-based situations or construction, agriculture, where it is hidden. Unlike the formal economy, usually these people are not included, or the work that is done by these people is not included in any country's gross national product. So if a country, for instance, says their gross national product is X million dollars, it may only represent half or in some cases up to 90% of what is going on within a country when the informal part is not included. However, as I wrote at the bottom of this slide, it's often stigmatized within countries as being troublesome, unmanageable, and is in many cases illegal. It's very difficult to get statistics, but the ILO has estimated from data that they have collected that within the northern and western parts of Europe, it's around 8.5% of the employment, and within Eastern Europe, around 16.8%. And in Europe specifically, this is different in other areas, but it's mostly concerned people in this section 1 that I talked about before, of people in the grey economy. That is, they are working in formal sectors, but the work is not being declared to the authorities. Now, there's reasons why they do that. It's often to avoid paying taxes or to avoid paying annual leave, sick leave, other things that would normally be required for them to the employer to pay. Now, just to give you some estimate of the size of this, Italy started to include estimates of its informal activity into their GDP calculations, and it resulted in an almost 20% rise in their GDP. So it's a big sector, even in a Western developed economy. And some of the countries in Europe have started to try to include some of the illegal activities that they know are going on. And that is also a significant part. So here you can see all of the countries in Europe on this slide, and you will see that the shadow economy, which is this grey economy that I talked about, was here in red. Perhaps I should have put it in grey, but it's in red. You can see that the countries up on the right-hand side, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, have Switzerland's, yeah, have the largest shadow economy, but as a proportion of their whole economy, it's actually very small. Whereas down the other end, Bulgaria, Romania, you can see, although the size is not as big, it's a much bigger proportion of the formal economy. So we tend to look at the formal economy as being a percent of gross domestic product for that reason, is that it doesn't depend on the very large income differences between countries. So you can see here there's various other estimates that I found. I will give you some links at the end of the presentation to where I obtained these statistics so that you can look at them yourself if you're interested. There's a few comments that I need to make on them, or I'd like to make. There is a direct relationship between the high self-employment in a country and the number of people who don't declare the work. That is the grey economy. And I've given some examples there that you can read for yourself. But you will see that where in the market sectors with a low proportion of informal economy activities, like the finance and business sectors, this gives you a very high GDP and a very low informal sector. It's much more difficult in those sectors to work informally. So that is an influence. And yeah, it's very closely related to the size and type of the industries. Also, there are differences in labor laws between, as I mentioned before, of exactly who gets covered by the statistics. So why do we have a grey economy? As I've talked about this before, people are wanting to avoid regulations quite deliberately. There may be wanting to avoid minimum wage laws or disability benefits. And these are quite substantial in Europe. They can be up to 20% of the wage costs. So many businesses, of course, when they're on the fringe of existence, will start to look for ways of avoiding paying these extra charges. But there are positive, there are positive sides to it too, that I showed an Uber driver before. Many of those, of course, are in the informal sector. They have more independence. They can work their own hours, and yeah, they have a lot of flexibility and self-determination in their job. That's the positive side of it. The negative side of that, of course, is that if you don't pay these benefits, they don't get paid into the social security funds, and that reduces the size of the whole bucket that later gets used to pay for people's sick leave or old age pensions. So it is in that way an unfair practice. And of course, like everything, being many of these activities are illegal, so people don't own up to it. There's also the specific issue of illegal immigrant workers in Europe, which I think is not unique to Europe. There are other countries where there are large sectors of both legal and illegal immigrants. It's a very hot topic in Europe at the moment, and you know, it's very difficult here to get reliable figures on exactly how many of these people are working and where they are working, because the politicians on the one side over exaggerate how many there are and what the problem is, and on the other side they underestimate, and it's in any case the situation is very fluid and is changing all the time. So we need to bear that in mind. So what are the main types of informal work in Europe? The statistics that we have and indicate that this grey area of people not declaring work is exceedingly common, or most common, should we say, in the construction industry, hairdressing and beauty, where people have home practices, their transport, Uber drivers, of course, gardening and cleaning on a house. That's again a household, on a household level. Provision of childcare or care of the elderly, again in home settings. But back in the formal sector, hotels, restaurants, catering, and this big growing area of information technology where people are doing gig work for companies over the internet, and they might be working in other countries. It's very difficult to follow or to control that area. But what do we need to do if we're looking at people's health and safety and well-being as ergonomists? The problems are that there is the type of risks in this work very much depends on what it is that they're doing. That's logical. So there are a very vast range of health risks in the informal sector. Some of them very serious, and some of them just annoying, but the range is what I want to emphasize. The one thing that the statistics have shown is that the working hours are a big problem, that people who work in the informal sector usually or often work much longer than what people work in the formal economy. That, of course, increases their risk of many other health or disorders, such as heart disease, depression, and all the disorders that are generally related to stress from not having enough rest time in their work. The second point I wanted to make is that there are a lot of women working in the informal sector, and although we know that there is a wage gap between men and women in the formal sector, even though they shouldn't in Europe, according to the laws, um, the gap is much bigger in the informal sector, where it's not controlled in any way or checked. Right. So that, of course, increases their risks. As I think I talked before about the social issues of people working in the informal sectors, they don't qualify for unemployment benefits. They don't qualify for pensions when they retire if they've never worked formally. If they have an accident, it can be exceedingly expensive because they're not insured. These are big risk factors in Europe because we don't have a social system that provides these services outside, particularly where there is people coming in from other countries who work in the informal sector, maybe much of their lives, that when they retire, there's no family here to look after them and they have no income from the pension funds. These can be very precarious situations. So what have we done about it? In a formal sector, of course, there are laws that govern how you treat your employees, and there are labour inspectors who check the compliance with the laws by making factory visits, such things. Employers have to be aware of the risks in their industry and must inform their employees about them, and of course provide safety equipment and such things to look after them. But in the informal sector, we do need to find out how we can tackle this, and this is where the TC is focusing its work. What we have learnt from the exchanges of experiences within the technical committee is that it's possible to use local groups. These people who work in these sections of the community often have networks of their own, that if you can find contact with those networks, you can use them to provide knowledge about risks and what can be done, and therefore empower the people to take responsibility themselves for their own health and safety. You can also encourage them to form cooperatives where they can maybe share personal protective equipment or share good practices about how to look after themselves. You can also work with your own government authorities if you, as a professional in your country, you have your own professional organizations that can talk with the government authorities about what they can do and provide them with some good practice examples from other countries. There are good practice examples, some of which I'll share with you in a moment. But the most important thing, I think, is to argue that with the government that they don't just wipe off the whole sector of informal work as being annoying, but try and help these people to improve their working conditions and yes, regulate where necessary, provide licenses, make them register themselves, but that will help. But formalizing might not be the answer in all cases. As I said, some people may have a vested interest in not being registered. Okay. At the European government level, the European Union has adopted a few measures to try to at least stop the growth in the informal economy. They certainly, their main policy is to try to get these people into the formal economy. So, as I said, you can use appropriate licensings and permit practices. You can encourage, or they encourage the authorities in the EU member countries to give tax breaks in things like household services, babysitting, these areas where informal work is very common. And but you can also, for the area of street vending, specifically work with the urban planners to make sure that these people have access to toilets, appropriate, decent lighting, yeah, a decent electricity supply, whatever it is they need, shelter from the weather. There's a lot of things that can be done to help them. Okay, I'm slowly going to wind up my talk here, but just to show you that these things do work, it's not just fantasy on my behalf. The countries that have tried to introduce some of these measures, I've given the example here of Germany, who introduced new laws in the year 2000, following the EU initiatives that I described in the previous slide. And they have seen a decline in the size of the undeclared economy, or the informal economy. That's a good 5 or 6%, well, 5% decrease in the undeclared economy, and it looks like it's heading in the right direction. At least it's not getting worse. And this is just the German example. There are other examples where it has started to work. So the take-home messages are, I think that I'd like you to think about formality and informality, not so much as a dichotomy, is a big division. There's grades of this. You can slowly move people with licenses or with other practices to move into the formal economies. All sorts of factors in society are going to affect how many people work in the informal economy. So it is a continually changing phenomena, but it's not as black and white as one would imagine. It's even in very developed countries, there are still there is still a large section of people working informally. And in the past, governments have had a lot of policies which really only focused on the formal sector, but particularly in the area of health and safety protection. Please encourage your governments to think about the people who work in the informal sector. And particularly us as human factors and ergonomic specialists, we can do a lot to educate and inform. That is my message. So this is the source of my statistics. I'll leave this up for just a minute while I introduce the next speaker, Dr. Christine Pfister from Germany, who is going to talk about the specific cases and areas that she has worked in. Hello, Christine. Can you take
Hello.
over?
Thank you for the introduction and your presentation. I will share my presentation now. It should work.
And I'll come back at the end, and we can have a look at the questions and have a discussion with each other, because I'm sure we both got questions. on the presentations.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much also for the opportunity to present here and also talk about one of my various research topics that I have. Today, I'm going to talk about the specific field of sex work in Germany. And my talk is based on my research at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Augsburg. That was about the regulation of sex work in Germany. Because I'm also a sociologist, but it's also informed by my work at the Institute of Occupational and Social Medicine and Health Services Research at the University Hospital of Tübingen, where I'm based now. And I don't have any conflict of interest. So what I'm going to present is based on analysis that we did on government documents, the parliamentary debates on the regulation on sex work in Germany over the course of time, and also the interviews and observations that we did on the ground after the latest regulation on sex work in Germany. And I'm going to give you kind of an historic view over the last 3 decades to give you kind of an understanding through the regulation of sex work on how Germany tries to grasp sex work as an industry and as work, and kind of what you do with this phenomenon in Germany. So to give you a context, like before 2001, prostitution has been legal for decades in Western Germany because Germany was reunified in 1990, but it was considered immoral, and the promotion of prostitution was illegal. So you could basically work as a sex worker, but it was considered immoral, and that had there was a twist that had consequences for people working in the industry. So people were obliged to pay taxes for their income, but they were at the same time denied access to social security, which is kind of a twist or like an imbalance. And they did not have legal means to fight for payment. So if they were kind of dependent on the willingness of people to pay for their services, actually. And they had a low quality of work environments because the promotion of prostitution was illegal. So giving a good working environment was kind of an indicator for promoting sex work. So the promoters were not encouraged to provide good work environments. So that was also very risky for sex workers, and they were prone to harassment and violence by police and also other authorities, and of course the clients and people from the organized crime. So in 1990, there was a first draft by the Green Party, which at that time was pretty rebellious in Germany, where they tried to frame sex work as an occupation like any other occupation. There was a rejected draft, but I decided to include it because it's interesting if you compare it to today. I took a quote from their draft where they present basically a law, and they also give a justification of why this is a suitable draft for a potential law. And here they claim that the aim of this law is to promote the elimination of discrimination against prostitutes. The activity of prostitutes as occupation is openly acknowledged and accepted as equal to others. Recognition as an occupation requires first and foremost the abolition of legal regulations that discriminate against prostitutes. So this was kind of going against the immoral part of prostitution and try to give sex workers the potential to have the same workers' rights than other occupations. And the framing of this draft was to see sex work under the lens of work in late capitalism that is defined by exploitation, and sexuality and patriarchy that is also exploitative for all women. Not so they were also pushing against the separation between women in sex work and outside of sex work, which was pretty progressive at that time. So the consequence for them was to support sex workers means also to fight against capitalism and to fight against patriarchy and to support all women in consequence. The draft was rejected, but the discussion was ongoing, and the question of like how to grasp the phenomenon, because it was clear that something has to be done. and also because parties kept on pushing several drafts to go for regulation. So in 2001, we finally had a successful draft for regulation of sex work in Germany that kind of defined sex work as dangerous but legitimate work, and that was kind of yeah, revolutionizing for the country. And it was also due to the fact that there was actually a court case where a sex worker who was also renting rooms to other sex workers was going to court against the authorities who tried to shut down her venue. And she was successful because the court also did a kind of a survey, and basically asking people if they're still against sex work and find it's like immoral. And so they proved that like the societal atmosphere had also changed. So they tried to go away from all those, let's say, big discussions on patriarchy, capitalism, and so on, be very pragmatic in the approach to regulate sex work. And I brought here another quote that I find kind of illustrative for the whole draft, where they say, prostitutes work in brothels, clubs, in the street, and in private homes. Their services are used daily by over 1 million men every day. This generates annual revenues in a double-digit billions every year. The state levies taxes on the income of prostitutes. Nevertheless, prostitutes are largely without rights and are discriminated against because of their work. As a result, they are forced into the milieu and forced to lead a double life. This also makes it difficult for them to leave. I don't know why it's kind of twisted here, but yeah, let's ignore that. So kind of what you see here is that the parties are now trying to also work with the numbers, something that you mentioned before, Maggie, with having these numbers of billions of potential tax incomes every year, and also over 1 million men that use the services every day, also to normalize kind of like the industry, and also to depict prostitution as a social reality, and also to show that the legal regulation is outdated in relation to the social reality. So that was kind of pushing for the normalization also of sex work. And the consequence was that they had a very, very small law that was always meant to be like a starting point to build on. And what the law did was to define that prostitution was no longer seen as immoral. So it stayed legal, but it was kind of taken out of the morality sector, let's say. And also that the promotion of prostitution became legal, so people could provide venues and events where sex workers could work. And this had a lot of consequences for sex workers. Some stayed, like the obligation to pay taxes, but they also had now access to social security, even though that stayed. Technically, it was there, but practically, it was very difficult to access social security. They had the legal means to fight for payment, which was also technically possible, but practically difficult. They were finally able to join unions. So there are some unions that are taking sex workers as members. For example, the union where I'm organized, this is also a union where sex workers are organized. So it's in the service sector, the union. We had now kind of unregulated work environments. So there was an increase of the quality of work environments because it was not illegal anymore to provide them, but it still was the quality was very heterogeneous in work environments. And of course, the harassment and violence by police and other authorities remained because of still the existing social stigma. So that was kind of the situation until for the next decade and a half, and there were a lot of discussions on how to build on this law because it was kind of a preliminary law, right? And so, but we also had a lot of government changes and so on, and Then we had also a long process in which NGOs, sex worker representatives, people from public authorities were included in parliamentary debates and so on to kind of discuss on how to regulate sex work now. And we also had a shift kind of in the discourse that can be seen very clearly in the legal regulation now that we have. Because now we have kind of this twist of prostitutes or sex workers kind of as people that are in danger. So it's not the work that is dangerous, but the people are kind of endangered, especially women. And it's also labeled again as no occupation like any other occupation, but still as an occupation. So there's a twist in it. But it can also be seen as the attempt to now regulate sex work kind of still as work. So it has kind of this, yeah, it's very ambivalent. So because the idea also behind the law is written here also in two quotes that I brought from this very, very long draft. It's like one of the longest draft I've seen. It's like, I think 160 pages. It's like immense. And they write, unlike other commercial sectors, however, commercial activities in the field of sexual services have not yet been subject to any specialized legal regulation tailored to their specific risks. There are no binding minimum requirements to protect the health and safety of those working in the sector, and no legal basis for checking the reliability of operators in advance and preventing unhealthy excesses in the trade. The lack of official supervisory instruments leads to a lack of transparency and favors criminal structures they take advantage of this deficit. So what we have here is kind of the attempt to kind of normalize prostitution as an occupation through defining monitorable minimum requirements. We also now read terms like protection of health and safety, for example, in the draft on sex work, also supervisory instruments, and also the comparison to other commercial sectors. So that's kind of the attempt to kind of put it into relation to other occupations in the field. And what is kind of the twist, though, is that it's kind of creating an extra law that is only tailored to prostitution. That is not necessarily the case for every occupation that exists in Germany. So instead of kind of building on existing laws that have been applied before, it's kind of now creating a new law that is kind of pulling different threads from other laws together. And that, of course, has an effect. And it's also tightly connected to kind of, let's say, the picture of the sex worker that the draft has in mind, and that is depicted here, which is kind of the section in the draft that directly follows what I have been reading out before. So here the draft says, at the same time, it must be taken into account that prostitution is often practiced by people who are in particularly vulnerable or stressful situations and who are therefore unable to stand up for their rights in a self-determined manner. Many of them also fear disadvantages in their social environment if their activity as a female or male prostitute becomes known. In this respect, prostitution is not an occupation like any other. So what we have here is we have a kind of a shift. If we go back to the 90s, where we have like a sex worker, there is no difference between sex workers and other women, for example. And sex workers are also more seen as entrepreneurs, for example, also in like the late draft. And now we have a shift towards sex workers as entrepreneurs, but also as very vulnerable and kind of lacking agency, which is built on a discourse that has been pushed into like discourse and practice on that is kind of having an equation between sex work and human trafficking, where kind of sex work automatically means being a victim of human trafficking or a survivor of sexualized violence, while it's kind of not separating those phenomenons and looking at the intersections where they actually are into play. So that's kind of very difficult. and the social stigma is still strong. That is also something, so like the promise of the previous law of kind of destigmatizing the occupation has not become into practice. So this is something that they're kind of attempting here, but still not attempting. And it's still, what we see here is kind of a backlash because we have an othering of prostitution as an occupation. So it's kind of trying to put prostitution and sex work into connection with other commercial sectors while othering it at the same time. So it's kind of a double bind message that we have here in the law and also in the practice. Because what we can see now is um, it's a very long catalog in this law on regulations that we can also see as an attempt to regulate sex work as work. Um, and it comes with a lot of regulations that sex workers have now, which is, for example, they are obliged to register with their full names and socio-demographic data, and also potential places where they are supposed to work. And this has to be renewed every 12 to 24 months, depending on their age. They have an obligation for a general consultation and a health-related consultation. It's not health and safety in regards to work, but like general health and safety regulations, health regulations, and they are also obliged to have the documents from those two aspects of the registrations and the counseling. They have to carry them with themselves all the time. And there's also not there's no separation because sex workers, like in the idea of the law, can potentially work all the time. So they're also supposed to kind of work, like carry it with them all the time, which is also kind of stigmatizing and very dangerous for people because they are there with their full data. We have a lot of regulations now for promoters of prostitutions. They also need to register their businesses. They are also they're obliged to not have a criminal record, particular in regards to migration law, substance abuse, and sexualized violence and other forms of violence. They are also they are obliged to submit an operating concept of like their venue and the parties and events that they're going to organize. And they are also obliged to document all the workers in their venues. So kind of the police and the authorities are also kind of giving them the task to control and survey the workers. And what I find interesting from the occupational health perspective also is the question of the working environments. So we have a regulation here that comes into play that is very new in comparison to the others, is that now so the rooms for sexual services are not supposed to be visible from the outside. There has to be an emergency call system. Rooms have to be opened from the inside at all times. There have to be sanitary facilities for the sex workers and all participating parties. There has to be recreation and break rooms. There has to be lockable storage facilities. And what was very debated is that the rooms where the sex workers work are not allowed anymore to be the rooms where they sleep. So they have kind of extra costs coming up for them. And we have also regulation for clients, so the obligation to wear a condom, and the authorities are allowed to enter the facilities at any given time, and they are also allowed to check all the relevant documents that the promoters are supposed to have. So we have a lot of regulation, but also a lot of open doors for authorities to kind of sneak into the sector. And what happened in practice? So there was a big disappointment, I guess, because the numbers of sex workers that registered are much lower than expected. There have been traveling numbers of hundreds of thousands of sex workers in the industry, which basically was not true. So that also means the taxes are much lower than expected. We have a patchwork of practices due to the federal structure and the local structure in the German political system. So basically, people also travel from one city to the next, depending on their authorities and how they work. social stigma is still strong for sex workers, and migrant sex workers, who are the largest share of sex workers in the industry, are underrepresented, also especially in the unions, and they are marginalized also in the public and legal discourse. So basically, white upper class sex workers basically threw them under the bus for their own purposes. And we have an increasingly right-winged agenda in Germany that pushes also to criminalize clients. And it became very difficult to discuss and deal with work-related health risks, because especially since the authorities that enter the venues, they're like the police, the tax officers, and so on, the customs, but they're not the health and safety engineers, and they're also not the occupational health physicians. And I think this is something that we can discuss for the future, and the support of the people working in the industry. So thank you very much. And I'm very looking forward to your questions and comments.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Christine. Were you supposed to have a presentation?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Did you actually have a presentation?
Yeah, did I not share my slides?
No.
Oh, why did you not say anything? Because to me it showed that the slides are shared.
Well, I didn't see. I
Oh,
don't know whether anybody else did, but it
oh,
didn't matter.
I was seeing slides.
Oh, Clive, oh, good. So
okay.
everybody else probably saw them. It's probably just me who didn't see them.
Okay,
It's the
thank
other
God.
presenter. But anyway, I found your presentation so clear and interesting that I thought, oh, well, I don't need them anyway.
Okay.
But that's fine. Sorry to worry you, Christine.
Okay,
But
no worries.
you remind me, because I came from I worked for the Swiss government,
Mhm.
and when I first started working for the health and safety authorities, I talked to the labor inspectors about the sex workers, because
Mhm.
as part of a gentrification plan, we had been moved into the area that or our offices had been moved into the area that used to be the red light district of Zurich. So there were a lot of the girls on the street that we walk past in the mornings and see, and in the evenings when we went home. But I know that when I suggested to the labor inspectors that maybe we should do something about these people, I was very quickly told, firstly, they went white. They're mostly all male. And then I was told they had no authority to go there anyway. So I'm thinking, it's going to be very hard to break down the stigmas. And I can see that you've been battling with that in this area to get an improvement. In the meantime, things have changed. I mean, that was 30 years ago, but now here in Switzerland, anyway, it is necessary for the girls to see a physician every year, but that's actually got to do with the working hour laws, that everybody
Mhm.
that works at night has to be checked once every year or 2 years, I've forgotten which, by a physician, and there's a checklist of issues related to permanent night work that they have to check. And when that first happened, the doctors very rapidly reported back to the authorities that this was exceedingly stupid, because that was the least of the problems that these girls had. And I can remember we then said, wrote back to the Doctors Association and said, we know that, but these girls need to be checked. They need somebody to go to when they've got problems, and it's your opportunity to educate them and steer them in the direction of where they can get help. And I think that after the first sort of bumpy start, that now has become much more institutionalized and more accepted. but it's still only the start. And yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It was very interesting to hear too in your talk the issue of the illegal or legal migrant workers in the sector being pushed out and presumably pushed back into the informal and even more informal sector. I wonder, does that happen in other industries? I suspect it does. Have you experienced in other industries of that sort of thing? Because I know this isn't the only industry you work in.
Yeah, to answer quickly, because I think Clive also has raised the hand. So yeah, I think what really makes sense is to look at sex work in similarity to the construction industry and agriculture and all those industries where we have a high percentage of informal work, and also migrant workers that kind of are in a limbo between, especially European states, where none of the social security systems wants to be responsible for them. So I think, yeah, that comparison makes sense.
I've just realized there's a question here come up for me. In your presentation, you talk about some types of informal jobs related to services. Yeah, does this informality also exist in other productive sectors? Is the percentage of workers the same? No, the answer is the percentage is not the same, but it certainly occurs in other sectors as well. In fact, as I said, it's much less common in finance and banking, which is very big in Switzerland, but it exists in agriculture, in domestic service. Well, I said domestic service. Catering, the catering industry is very common with informal work. Yeah, it's certainly in other sectors, but it varies between sectors. That's my answer to that question. Okay. Now we've got some chat. Somebody's chatting. This is very hard for me to read. Sorry, old age.
Oh, that's just Clive telling people to.
Ah, right. Yes. Okay. So do we have any other questions from people? Clive?
Hey, Maggie,
Hello?
yeah, Maggie, I don't. I was just pointing out that you had a question from one of our attendees. That was all. Yep. But I do know that regarding Elvia's question, that she had mentioned, we do see a lot of informal work happening in production and manufacturing in some of the lower and middle income countries, right? So based on our previous webinars that we've organized, we've definitely see it kind of skewed less towards service, but more towards manufacturing, production, including from presentations from Latin America. Right? So some of this is also like there's a regional flavor to informal work around the world.
Yeah, but I think that's important to mention, but also to understand that also in the countries where we had a high percentage of formal work and good regulations also for a lot of workplaces, increasingly more people are slowly pushed out of those kind of contracts. By especially in production, that's a good example, because all of a sudden we have this system between workers that are employed directly by the company and workers that are kind of rented. And they fall under completely different contracts and regulations, and also opportunities that they have. And I think this is also a way of kind of slowly, like, kind of pushing workers apart and solidarity between workers, but also to decrease the number of people that actually have those also expensive working conditions for most companies. Yeah.
I think that's very true. There's a very steep rise in short-term work contracts and things. Employers find ways around the systems. Anyway, I think we have to sort of slowly wind up because we've reached the end of our time. fascinating as it would be to continue. Thank you very much, Christine and Clive, for giving us the opportunity, and particularly for Christine for being prepared to share the experiences that she had in that industry, which has got lots of problems, as we see.
Yeah, thank you so much for including me.
Well, keep up the good work. All the best to everybody, and thank you to the participants for your attention. Bye, everyone.